Good morning, folks. Good morning. Oh, I didn't hear much of a good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Great. Thank you. Well, good morning and welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you here with us today for the Thomas Merton in Alaska 50th anniversary celebration. My name is John Harmon, and I'm the Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Anchorage. And before I introduce our first speaker, I want to give you some logistics and then share a brief story about Sister Arlene and her experience with Thomas Merton when he was here in Alaska. So from a logistics perspective, the first thing is with cell phones. Just want to remind folks, if you have cell phones, this is the perfect time to put them on vibrate or to turn them off. Second thing is, as it relates to food and drink, you may not have seen the sign. It's pretty small out there, but we've asked that people not have any food or drink in the sanctuary. So if you could please respect the sanctuary and leave the food and drink outside. There will be a break after this first session. And again, I know sometimes the tendency is to bring stuff back with you, but again, if you could leave it outside the sanctuary. If you're looking for the bathrooms, for those of you who haven't been here before, if you go out the sanctuary, take a right, there's a sign, it keeps falling down. I put it up again, but they're right to the left there. Or you can ask somebody, they may be able to help you find it. At the bottom of the stairs, that's good, yes. The bottom of the stairs there's also, so thank you. As it relates to, after we're finished with the Professor Dart's presentation, there'll be some snacks and such in the Mickey Center. So again, you go out the sanctuary, head down to the right, and it's over to the right. You could probably follow folks as you're going down there. And then after our Professor Dart finishes speaking, if we have time, there will be question and answer. We're going to have a mic that I believe Anna or Kevin or somebody's going to bring around. So if you raise your hand and you're recognized, if you could just wait a brief period of time until you have the mic so everyone can hear you. And likewise, the session is going to be recorded. So that way they'll be able to hear it on the recording as well. Now for my brief story. Peggy Bergsrud, who is the archivist for the Archdiocese of Anchorage, shared with me a historical document from our archives. It's an excerpt written by Sister Kathleen Boyd, who many of you here in the Archdiocese knew as Sister Arlene. She passed away a couple years ago. She was one of the Sisters of Mercy, and she kept a diary of her first 3 years here in Alaska. She came up in 1967 from back east to be a teacher, and was just amazed and fascinated with Alaska, and wrote about her, or kept track of her adventures. And as we were going through this document, it was very interesting because in there was a passage she wrote about Thomas Merton and his visit to Alaska. So to kick things off this morning, I thought a great way to start would be to share with you an experience that she had with Merton about 50 years ago to the week here in Anchorage. Sister Arlene wrote, "In late September 1968, Thomas Merton visited Anchorage at the invitation of Archbishop Ryan. He gave a day of recollection to the priests and sisters and was available to anyone who required consultation. He prayed to see snow while he was in Alaska, and, believe it or not, on September 28th, we had our first snowfall. Merton was satisfied, and we were all impressed. We invited Merton to dinner at the Marion House during his stay in Anchorage. He was a delightful man with sparkling, laughing eyes and a cheerful manner. During the conversation at dinner, Merton mentioned to us that the novices had fondly referred to him as Uncle Louis. Later that same evening, Sister Alfonsa jokingly addressed Father Merton as Uncle Louis. Merton loved it. He slapped his hand on the table and he exclaimed, 'Now we are communicating.' We loved him and considered it a great gift to share his presence even for a short time." Again, that's an excerpt from Sister's diary from back in the 60s. So I think it's a great way to share and start things off related to Merton. And with that experience of Sister Arlene in mind, I hope that Uncle Louis would be pleased with all the information provided at the conference today, and he would smile upon all of us knowing that now, with this conference, we're beginning to communicate. So to start our exciting communication for the day, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you folks Professor Ron Dart. And let me read a brief bio, and then I'll bring him up. So, Professor Ron Dart is a professor of political science, philosophy, and religious studies at the University of Fraser Valley in Canada. He has authored numerous books and articles on Erasmus, Merton, and spirituality, including the book Thomas Merton and the Beats of the North Cascades, and his recent book titled Thomas Merton and the Counterculture, A Golden String. He has published over 35 books and is currently working on a book about Hermann Hesse and Thomas Merton. Professor Dart is an avid mountaineer and a board member of the Thomas Merton Society in Canada. So it's both an honor and a pleasure to have Professor Dart with us this morning. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dart.
Well, it's a joy to be here. I was here 10 years ago, drove up from the British Columbia, Cascade Mountains. We did a 3-day trip, and it was the 10th. It was the 40th anniversary of Thomas Merton being here. We were privileged and treated to stay at the St. John Center out in Eagle River. And so 10 years later, I have returned, and the hospitality continues to exceed our expectations, and you've been a very gracious and wonderful host while we're here. I'm going to entitle this, since I'm in Alaska, Thomas Merton, Catholic Denali. Thomas Merton is interpreted in a variety of ways like a great mountain, and depending on the trail you go up, you're going to see different parts of Thomas Merton. Some want to see Thomas Merton as on the extreme progressive edge of Roman Catholic thought, and you want to say yes and no. Some are going to see him as situated around Pope John the 23rd's period of Catholic thought, and you will say yes and no. Some react strongly to Thomas Merton. They don't want anything to do with him. And others who see his turn to the mothers and fathers of the church of the patristic era of the 2nd to the 6th centuries as many ways the roots of his own thinking, and out of that the contemplative tradition, a meditative tradition he's trying to revive, and see the relevance of that for people's transformation and their deeper spiritual journey. What I'm going to talk about briefly today is Thomas Merton, Russia, and Orthodoxy, for the simple reason Merton was very interested in Russia, within the Russian Orthodox tradition, and his second conference up here in 1963 dealt with important thinkers within the Russian Orthodox tradition. Merton was very much an expansive, like a mountain itself, a great breadth and depth to him, great heights, many trails he trekked, and to understand what he's trying to get at in his life, his all too short life, it's important to touch down on some of the places he lingered at, the paths he trekked, the ridges he stood on, and the summits he saw from in his journey. The Russian Orthodox tradition, there's 3 ways we can approach that, and that would be the roots of the great Russian Orthodox and Orthodox tradition, which go back to the mothers and fathers of the church from the 2nd to the 7th century. I'm not going to touch on that, but Merton often referred to those roots, whether the fathers of the Eastern Church or of the Western Church itself, as a way of understanding faith in a meditative, contemplative way. Often when people study theology, it can be biblical theology, historic theology, systematic theology, but the question is, so what's that mean for my journey? What's that mean for my self-understanding? What does it mean for my transformation? What does it mean for knowing myself better and deeper, facing those shadow elements in myself, the potential of who I could be? The fathers and mothers of the church very much explored that. In that sense, they wanted to know what's the personal implications and applications of thinking to the life journey itself. And in that sense, they were what Merton would call very existential in their thinking. I won't touch on that, but those are the roots, and that's one element of Merton's interest in Russian Orthodoxy, and to understand the Russian Orthodox tradition that's a part of it. The second would be the great trunk which emerges in Orthodoxy itself, of the many writers, men and women, who again explored the inner life, the nature of that journey, what it meant to live in Christ, to live in the body of Christ, and to live in the world as we know it. And again, it wasn't just about ideas, thinking about faith, knowing the creeds, knowing the councils, liturgy, sacrament. What did all this mean in terms of being internalized in becoming our new being? And so again and again, Merton, unlike an academic, he was master of novices and scholastics. He had to constantly be translating and transferring these important historic ideas that the church has given as a gift of grace in terms of the internalization of what that meant. But again, within that Russian tradition, there is a whole host of thinkers, communion of the saints in that sense, who pass on that story, and not to know it is to be bereft of a mother lode in that sense of what we can draw from in terms of the journey forward as the people of God. But the fruit I'm going to briefly touch on today of the Russian Orthodox tradition, I'll be looking at just a couple of thinkers that were very important to Thomas Merton in his life. He was mostly interested and delved deeper for the pearls at the as it were, the bottom of the water of history. A couple of key thinkers in this regards, and one was, some of you probably saw, and I would assume many treasure, the film that won the 1965 prize, Sound of Music. Another film came out that year, which probably many of you have seen. Some of you may not have. It's probably comes from a much richer in terms of the layered nature of life and the journey and the tragic side of life, the hopes and dreams, the fragile side of the human journey, the unpredictabilities, is Dr. Zhivago. The nature of these two films, of course, are quite different. The Sound of Music, it's what you call a comedy, like Dante's Divine Comedy in that sense. You have on the one hand, the husband who's lost his wife. He runs his home like a military, which of course doesn't work well with young kids. He's longing for another relationship which is going to complete perhaps his more stern and militaristic side. And then you have this young woman at a convent trying to sort out her vocation. Should she be a nun, or are there other options? So Maria is trying to figure out her life journey. You bring the two together eventually. Captain von Trapp ends up finding that he's a woman that just speaks to him deeply, touches something deeper in him, more softer, more tender, rather than that very disciplinary military side. And she also is able to speak to his 6 children. She discerns her vocation. They get married, and then, of course, with the Nazis in Germany, the Anschluss takes place, and they get out. At that time, cross the Austrian Alps, and it's a happy ending. It's a happy ending in that sense. And so it's a feel-good sort of movie. The other movie that came out was Dr. Zhivago. Very, very different type of story. It isn't necessarily a happy ending. It takes place in the midst of the Russian Revolution of 1917. You have Yuri Zhivago. He becomes a well-trained doctor. He grows up in more the aristocratic class. But he's aware of the terrible injustices in Russia at the time between the wealthy aristocrats, the entrepreneurs like Komarovsky, and then people on the streets who were very poorly paid, and poverty and death and illness. And he senses also keenly and astutely and acutely the terrible injustices which are about to come upon them. And it's the story of initially his marriage within the Gromyko family and the Tanya, they have a child, but then of course the revolution begins to occur in Russia itself. And it's the story of both Tanya and he being separated, trying to find his way, meeting Laura, and then of course the tragedy of that story at the end. He ends up in the novel itself, meeting another woman when back in Moscow. But it's a story of, on one hand, tender hope, possibilities, on the other hand, constantly the highest expectations being thwarted. And so it's a tragic comedy of what life can really be like. We enter into life with hopes, expectations, plans, goals, and then there's life. There are these tensions that come together. And how does one live in the tension between the tragic, and the comic? Now, Merton had warned Boris Pasternak, and this is this sort of circuitous route, which I'm bringing to the point here. He had, in 1958, Thomas Merton had written Boris Pasternak in Russia. This was before Dr. Zhivago had been translated into English, and Boris Pasternak won the Nobel Prize in 1958 for Dr. Zhivago. It's a very layered, rich, lyrical. Pasternak was very, very much a novelistic poet, a brilliant writer and characterization, and he understood life in much more of a nuanced way than many writers do. But Merton is also at a phase of his life in 1958 where he's merging in some ways from a winter of enclosure into the spring of opening up to new things in life. Interestingly enough, how Dr. Zhivago itself begins as a novel and a movie, initially with Yuri Zhivago's mother dying, and then gradually you begin to see the spring of life occurring, and then the seasons of life itself. So Thomas Merton ends up writing Boris Pasternak, just mentioning, I sense a kindred to you as a human being. I sense the struggles that you are going through. And of course, Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago, was seen as a stinging rebuke in many ways of the Soviet system. And much of the novel is a story of the sheer violence of the center-left, of the partisans and the Reds, and what it did to Zhivago, his wife, the family, communities, everything else. I mean, who wants to be thrown into a context of what Martin Heidegger talks about, thrownness of that level of violence and the impact on people's lives? And how do you hold relationships together when everything's so unpredictable, so uncertain, and you don't know what's going to happen the next day? Very, very difficult to live one's life with minimal integrity. It's interesting, the first poem of the Zhivago cycle is Hamlet. And Hamlet, one of Shakespeare's great tragedies, deals with many of these same issues, very difficult issues itself. So in 1958, this is Thomas Merton's beginning a correspondence with Boris Pasternak, and there's 6 exquisite, very tender letters between these two writers. The one very much feeling his way out of the winter of the monastic world in which he had retreated for a few years, in the 1958 Walnut Street experience, also the engagement with Boris Pasternak. And so these letters are very, very important in understanding Merton and Boris Pasternak and his engagement with Russian thought itself. Merton also at this time is exploring, in which I might just backtrack a little bit. It was very unusual for people living in North America in the 1950s to see Russia in any sort of a positive light. There were 2 great forces in the world. There was the first world, and if we live in North America, we were the good, the true, the beautiful, the kind, the generous, and then there was nasty, evil Russia. And so it was a comic book way almost of seeing the world, and so that anyone who would try and transcend that sort of dualistic tribalism, Merton was some degree seen as a bit of a traitor, as was Pasternak, because he dared to question what was going on. So you have 2 men here who are transcending, on one hand, the political ethos of their time. Pasternak, through writing Dr. Zhivago and what it meant to live in those trying and troubling times, And then you had Thomas Merton, who was raising all sorts of questions in the 1950s about First Nations issues. Isha means man. Then you've got ecological issues, military issues, Cold War issues, and neither of them were completely at home in their own context. They were often opposed, treated indifferently in many ways, and they found kindreds in that sense who they could attach themselves to, and they felt that here's someone I can relate to. I'm not alone in this world in the issues I'm struggling with. There's someone I'm knit soul to soul with in terms of my longings and my struggles. I might also add that not only was Merton dealing with the political element of the Cold War and trying to transcend it, as a Roman Catholic, there had also been a history between the Roman Catholic tradition and Orthodoxy, in which for hundreds of years they had kept their distance. And there weren't many people bridge building between these two traditions, between Orthodoxy, whether Russian, Greek, any of the variations of the Orthodox family. So at this period of time, Thomas Merton is very much trying to say, listen, we need not live in this fragmentary, divided, divisive world. Our faith, above all else, is about unity. It's not only knitting people together, souls together, communities together. Why should we continue to stay in these isolated tribes and clans when our faith is, in fact, about bringing people together? And in that sense, he is very much relevant and timely for this period, for what you can see happening in the United States, where you get people dividing. We're also seeing these things in Canada. So it's not somehow, and it's also happening in Europe, where people separate, fragment into little tribes, clans. They shrink the nature of reality to their temperament, to their clan, and then they throw stones at those who are not of them in that sense. So you get in someone like Thomas Merton, he's very much transcending that. Another key thing and actually one of Thomas Merton's longest articles is called the Pasternak Affair. So not a literal affair in that sense, but a literary affair, a political affair, and an ecclesial affair, in which he's trying to say there's a history here of people not talking. How can we overcome that? And how do we do that? It's by recognizing our commonness in the other. And the test of that is how do we treat the so-called enemy, the foreigner, the alien, the outcast, and particularly when there is a history of us actually being one, but because of the accidents of history, we have become separated and we caricature other people in that sense. Merton held a high priority for friendship. Question he would have are, who are your friends? Who are those who are with you on your side in your journey through life, those you can trust? And do they cross cultures? Or do we just stay in our own culture and our own clan? And who are those who in fact are with us on the journey? And the Pasternak story is very, very much one. Boris Pasternak and Thomas Merton transcending their political backgrounds, their ecclesial backgrounds, to unite. And with Pasternak's death in May 1960, that was the end of that correspondence. I might also add that for Thomas Merton and Boris Pasternak, at times in their loneliness, at times in their alienation, the tendency would be to turn in and say, poor me, I'm oppressed, I'm being treated indifferently, I'm not being listened to. They initiated volumes and volumes of correspondence with people who contacted them, and this was their way of knitting together with others. So they had a choice when they hit hard patches in life. There was a crossroads. They either could take the position as Pasternak was oppressed, he was mistreated, misread by the Soviet Writers' Union. Merton was often caricatured for his work both in Gethsemane, but the larger Cistercian order and Catholic Church. The one position would be to say, I'm going to retreat like a turtle under my shell. The other is to say, no, this is an opportunity in my suffering and my struggle and my loneliness to enter into the struggle and the loneliness of others. So the loneliness actually is a gift. It's a gift that has been given, and it can be used. It's like being put on the anvil and being transformed. The soul is being transformed from bronze to silver to gold, if we allow that to occur. And so for Merton and Pasternak, given their dire situation, obviously Pasternak in Russia, Dr. Zhivago, and Merton at Gethsemane, they allowed their disappointments, their betrayals, their loneliness to be turned into something good. And we can see people often will hit crossroads in life, and depending on they deal with the tragedies, the difficult things in life, they either become deeper or better people on their journey, or they begin to shrink as people. Or what C.S. Lewis says, they become bent in that sense. And there's crooked lines in their soul that are not dealt with, and toxics gets into their soul and poisons. Or the other option is they work on those elements in the lineaments and lines of their soul, and they become deeper people because of it. So the correspondence was very important for Pasternak and Merton. One of the things is very, very much on front stage today is the importance of the whole spirituality and wisdom traditions versus just theology that's cut loose from wisdom and spirituality. And the question Merton would ask, as many of the people today are asking who've had very good trainings in the life of the church and seminaries and other places. So what does this all mean for a growing, transformative life journey in Christ in the church? And the whole spirituality wisdom tradition is very much challenging a certain approach to theology that doesn't deal with that. And in that sense, Merton was way ahead of his time in saying, listen, the contemplative spirituality, the meditative, going deeper in, listening to what may be a little deeper. He was decades ahead of his time in terms of today. There are conferences, retreats, many things going on, and this is why Merton remains a lingering pioneer. And the volumes he wrote on the contemplative life, the wisdom tradition, the meditative way, and really what it means deep down to hear. His first article in the Pasternak Affair, he calls The People with Watch Chains. So I'll just read, it's an earlier poem from Pasternak. My sister called life like a tidal wave breaking swamps the bright world in a wall of spring rain. But people with watch chains grumble and frown with poisoned politeness like snakes in the corn. There tend to be two traditions, and Merton was very much interested in not a tradition of what we would call a puzzle mentality or certainty, but the importance of mystery. Let me just explain this a bit and what it means to be snakes in the corn in that sense. There are those who, their way of thinking, it's very much life's a puzzle, as it were. In a simple way, you get a recipe to cook cookies, follow it through, the cookies come out, the puzzle's solved. In a more sophisticated way, you put planes together. You figure out how that worked, they fly, the puzzle is solved. And in more sophisticated ways, you want to put a plane out of space, you solve it. It's a puzzle. You can put things together like a puzzle. And then, of course, that way of thinking is, well, that all of life is like a puzzle. I should be able to figure it out. And if I can't figure it out, or if things go bad, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? Is it something where's God in a situation like that? How do you solve a puzzle of the Russian Revolution when you're in the thick of it? When much is unpredictable. How do we solve puzzles when any of us live through tragedies or difficulties in life where things don't work out the way we had hoped? How do we solve puzzles when children are ill unexpectedly or there's deaths? When families fragment and no one can anticipate something like that? That's not a puzzle question or what we call a question of a comedy, because comedies like like Sound and Music, that in one sense ends good. It's the Walt Disney approach to life. And Merton was very, very much opposed to that puzzle, Walt Disney, divine comedy. It's true sometimes, but in a lot of things in life, life does not work out that way. So where is God then? Where is God then in the tragedies, the mysteries, the unpredictabilities of life? This is why Dr. Zhivago was so important in many ways to Thomas Merton, and Boris Pasternak in some ways is a Dr. Zhivago figure. And so the people with watch changers are always wanting to say, this is how it should work out. If you do this, it's like a formula, and good will come out of it. Just got an email from my wife today, and our daughter's, she's in her mid-30s, and we never quite know what she's going to do next, and takes us from one trouble to another. And I'm sure this will continue for the next 20 years. Is there a way to solve the problem? Is there no, we don't know the pieces, how you put it together. It's just how do we somehow stay with her on the journey as she turns against us at times and sees us as the problem. And others will say, well, you didn't figure this out, or you didn't do this, or you didn't pull this rabbit out of the hat at this particular time. Well, come on, life's not a puzzle in that sense. Okay, there's a mystery here of ambiguity, unpredictability, people's choice, and not knowing how it works out. So in that sense, the mystery approach, was a lovely complement and dancing partner, as it were, to the watch chain people who said, this is the time, this is when it works out. And apparently I'm also supposed to be on time here for something like this. I don't want to accuse this of being a watch chain, but we do have to keep the ship sailing across the water here well and wisely, and hopefully the waters are good for us as we do take this craft into the open water. Now, so this would be the first element of Merton and in Orthodoxy, 1958. So this is before his trip here in 1968. And many of the themes in the Pasternak affair, this article, there was also a nice article before that. It's called Russian Mystics, and he highlights very nicely some of the key Russian mystics, particularly those who were married and they had to make sense of their spirituality in the context of marriage rather than turning to the monastic or the priestly vocation and charism in that sense. He looks at those who sometimes their spirituality is too dark, too much into suffering, and not enough of the light, okay? The whole transfiguration light, or the Tabor light, as he would call it. And he explores the great Philokalia, the Russian and Orthodox tradition of spirituality, the 5 volumes, an amazing work of which Timothy Ware, who's still living, has continued. I might add that the recent book from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and Timothy Ware and Jim Forrest, very, very much is continuing the work that Thomas Merton initiated in the 1950s. I did a review of Archbishop Rowan Williams' book, and he sent me a lovely email back saying, you just caught the essence and the real spirit of the book and what I'm trying to do, so thank you very much for that. So I would say the 1958, the Pasternak affair article, the letters between Boris Pasternak and Thomas Merton, and in the Appendix A in this lovely little book, Disputed Questions, Merton also adds a little more to the story because Pasternak is dying at this time. He's aware that he is dying. He did in 1950, and he just reflects on the importance of touching Pasternak's soul, going to places which very few did with Pasternak. And there's a touching section in this Appendix A where it brings out someone who is at the level of almost literary high mucky mucks, where they win the Nobel Prize for Literature. People corresponded with Pasternak already. They sensed in him a humanness, a kindness, a graciousness, that they knew they would be listened to as they were struggling with some of their most difficult and deepest issues. And there's a lovely section in Appendix A where this couple who hardly were known at all in Germany, a gas station, they corresponded with Pasternak, and he went out of his way to contact friends in Germany, said, could you buy them a little present and just take it to them as a gift? So it was that level of tenderness in regards to people that nobody would ever know. And from a Nobel Prize winner in terms of the Zhivago was the great novel of the 20th century, that this level of detail to people and saying, what can I do to make their life a little richer? Just a little gift, a little something. And I have friends in this part of Germany, so could they take it over to them? So it's that level of what Merton would talk about. At the highest level, is there love? Is there a human factor? Is there kindness? And if all the religious rituals and forms and apparatus do not bring about that, there is something missing, and that's what Merton was, a great Christian humanist. I'll just read from this section in which, in Dr. Zhivago, Laura's first husband, Pasha, became Strelnikov. Because of the suffering he saw, increasingly so, he became so idealistically political that he'd be willing to sacrifice his wife, his family, and he became, in one sense, a driven terrorist, trying to purge Russia of those who are wealthy and create a classless state. And he finally left Laura, and there's this lovely saying, it says, or she's reflecting it was as if something abstract had crept into his face and made it colorless, as if a living human face had become the embodiment of a principle, the image of an idea. I realized that this had happened to him because he had handed himself over to the superior force that is deadening and pitiless and will not spare him in the end. It seemed to me that he was a marked man and that this was the seal of his doom. What happens when we become victims just of ideas, in which we try and force people into the Procrustean bed of an idea and we lose our humanness in the purpose. In the lectures, particularly Conference 2, in his time here in Alaska, and particularly his conferences in Eagle River, he uses Vladimir Lossky, a very, very important Russian theologian who was part of the exiles that went to Paris, or the Parisian exiles that ended up, many of them founding St. Vladimir's in the United States. Vladimir Lossky looks at the difference between individualism, in which people just think only of themselves, their own fulfillment, their own happiness, and community friendships are secondary to that. Lossky says, what's the difference between individualism and personhood? What does it mean to be a person versus an individual? The other distinction that's being made is that between community and the collective. And of course, in Russia, as in elements at times of the church, you can get the collective. You don't raise critical questions. You don't raise troubling issues, and so you just fit into the collective. Almost like a Borg if one isn't careful at times. So Lossky says, how do we hold together the importance of personhood and community, and rather than the dangers of the collective or individualism in that sense? And much of the second conference, he deals with this. And in doing so, Laura, I'll use Laura again, I teach with a woman, she's from St. Petersburg. She says when her parents are annoyed with her, they call her Larissa. But Laura is the more intimate name. So Laura, this is why, yeah, Laura. And in trying to understand the role of personhood and community, we get into the complex and layered nature of what it means to be human. The best aspirations of what community might be, and yet the reality of real humans in community and the difficulty of working that out. And the danger always is in something like that. We either remain loyal to a tradition, don't ask hard questions even though internally they may be pressing to live, Zhivago just means in Russian life, Dr. Life. What does it mean to be fully alive as a human being? Or as Irenaeus would say, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. What does it mean to be alive? And in that process, people are always having to sort through what St. Paul would call the old Adam or the old Eve, that part of us which can be narcissistic, self-centered, and the best of our new being in Christ and the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in that sense. So as people begin to take that journey, they realize there's a war going on inside, a tension in which they are trying to live towards the light, but there is always the shadow and the darkness within. And there's no silver bullet in that sense that's going to solve that issue. That is with us on our human pilgrimage through time itself. It's Laura says once again, it's only in mediocre books that people are divided into two camps and have nothing to do with each other. In real life, everything gets mixed up. Don't you think you'd have to be a hopeless nonentity to play only one role in all your life? To have only one place in society, always to stand for the same thing. And so with Losky's work, particularly this notion between personhood and community, the other thing Merton will mention is the Russian notion of kenoticism, okay, of letting go, and particularly letting go of those things that we need to let go of, and having the discernment to know what are those things we are to die to let the brittle leaves fall from the tree, so that in the spring of our life we will begin to see our new being and the fruit which will come in our life. But that often involves deaths of that which we have to die to. So in fact, the seed of our new being will emerge in the springtime and summer of our life. And in the autumn season, the fruit will be what it's meant to be. But that is often a difficult journey, and this is where in the Russian tradition, the spiritual director, in the Western tradition, the Abba or the Amma or the starets, and you'll get that in Dostoevsky's novels, Zosima and people like this, who are the women and men you can trust with your soul on your journey, and what all that means in terms of the internal life itself. And Merton says, drawing from Losky, he says that the danger is to too much, and this has to be looked at carefully, is to overemphasize the Christological and ignore the role of the Holy Spirit in our life and what that means for our day-to-day massaging of the soul, guiding, leading, shaping. And the danger is if we just do the forms of the church, somehow it's all going to magically happen. Well, it also involves, in the language of orthodoxy, synergism, the two working together, our responsibility to facing into our journey with others and with those that respect, and also the grace of God, guiding, shaping, massaging, transforming, deifying, all a part of the faith journey in its various maturing stages of transformation. And so Losky is very, very, very good on that, and that kenotic element of letting go, so we really become who we really mean who we're meant to be. But each person has to name those things in the community of friends they trust, or what we call soul friends. The Celtic tradition, it's called rinsing your eyes. Rinsing the eyes of the soul, so we see better. Interesting that Dr. Zhivago, as he went on in his special area, was seeing, okay, the eyes, and it's those who see, which are very important in that sense. The other one, given my anglicized Russian, is sobernost. Is that how you pronounce it? Sobernost, yeah. So in the second conference, when he was in Alaska, Vladimir Losky emphasized this, very important, which is about unity. Not only formal unity, material unity, but a deeper level of soul unity with others. Who are we knit together with at a deeper level? We trust on our journey. They'll be with us each step of the journey. And how does that take place? What's community, sobernost, friendship, sobernost, community, the more material and formal elements of that unity. And the Russian tradition had this very high emphasis in what it meant. And it's often we have to let go, the kenotic, so we will understand what it means to be bonded together with one another. And that's what the faith is about. It's raising up a whole new, this is the kingdom of, in one sense, the kingdom of God. our deepest longings are finally met as we let go of many things and enter into, that's why the symbol obviously in Christianity is the cross, but also the empty cross at the same time. We have to go to the cross many times, and then we resurrect phoenix-like many times as well on the journey. So in Lasky's, so the second conference went in Alaska at Eagle River. Merton drew very deeply from Vladimir Lasky, part of the Parisian exiles that, as I said, came over to the United States. Looked at the importance of being sensitive. He argues, perhaps fairly or unfairly, that can be discussed, but the role of the Holy Spirit in entering into being attentive. And this is where the contemplative and the wisdom tradition, learning to slow down, to be quiet, to listen, finding those places of silence and solitude. Because we tend to be addicted, as Hannah Arendt once said, where we have reversed in the richness of the classical Christian tradition. It always said the roots of our new being are the vita contemplativa, and out of that comes the vita activa, or the active or the busy life. We've reversed that to some degree with the coming to be of Protestantism and what happened to the monasteries. And people like Merton, Lasky, Pasternak, they were all trying to reverse the reversal of saying, how do we get to that place of being still and being silent? And out of that, we may hear and see things we would never hear and see if the faster and faster we go. Because often the busier we are, the less we see. And sometimes the slower we go, the more we see. But it's very hard in a culture which is addicted to doing, performing. Evelyn Underhill once said, we spend too much time conjugating three verbs, to want, to have, and to do, and we don't know how to conjugate the verb to be. And this is what Merton was trying to get at, Pasternak was trying to get at, Evelyn Underhill was trying to get at. They found great riches in that in the Orthodox tradition, but the mother lode was also in the Roman Catholic tradition as well. And so Merton was very much digging in that mine shaft in the Roman Catholic tradition, trying to revive that. He found it in the Orthodox tradition. Obviously, he had a great interest in the interfaith work, because who were the people who were still trying to live a contemplative life in the modern world, and this is where he found elements, obviously, with the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, and many other people. Not that he was always on the same page with them theologically, but he found in some of their analysis of what it meant to be human and what we had to die to, let go of, quite poignant and insightful, and also some of the methods they used, also very, very helpful in terms of that transformation. I'd like to end with a little story. My wife's a harpist. We have 4 harps in the house, big concert harp, a troubadour harp, Celtic harp, Uruguayan harp. I always have harps going, and never stops 3 hours a day. Beautiful sound, obviously. She's like Galadriel out of Lord of the Rings or something, you know. We often have deer, and I mean, I don't want to romanticize deer, you living up here and also where I live. They can get into your well-crafted gardens, and I know they can be nasty. But we often have deer, and I'll end with this story, which Merton uses the image, the metaphor of the deer also in one of his stories, one of his later books on the contemplative. We often have deer quietly and suggestively poke their noses out of the forest. We live on the top of a mountain. But if people are noisy, busy, clattering about, doing what they usually do, clock chain people, sort of, they stay hidden. They stay hidden in the forest. But when dusk comes, or dawn, they'll often poke their little noses out, and if it's quiet and still, they'll timidly come down the hills from the forest. And my wife said, we had 5 of them coming down regularly at dawn and dusk. She says, I'm going to take my harp out and play to them, and I want to see what happens. So I'm sort of a musical Orpheus, sort of, you know, very Celtic in tendency, very Irish in leanings, very German in roots. So she gets out, starts playing, and all 5 of them come down. She continues to play, and they all surround her, and they just all lay down beside her. She continues to play as they're laying there, and then she stops. She was actually a little frightened with all these animals around her. This is an unusual experience. So, and then when she stopped, they all rose up, and there was a lovely 5-point buck. He comes up to her, he bows his head, and they all 5 retreated into the forest, never to be seen again. The contemplative is very much about allowing the deer within to come out of the forest, amidst many fears and insecurities, and the harp of the divine is always being played, string after string, calling us again to sit by the great eternal harper. And if we are willing to do that in all of our fears, our insecurities, our uncertainties, the difficulties, the tragedies of life, we come to sit beside the great eternal harper. Our real being in terms of the image and likeness of God, it begins to emerge in a very meaningful way. And then sometimes the deers just disappear again, and you wonder where God is in the journey, and those doubts and questions, which are very much a part of the ongoing. And Merton, in that sense, was a great doubter, a great seeker. He was ever loyal, but ever critical. He was very loyal to the church. Some people, as I mentioned earlier, can be very loyal but not critical. Some can be critical but not loyal. Much more difficult to live in the tension of honest criticism, concerns, fears, but being very loyal. And that's much more difficult than just being loyal and not asking hard questions, or being critical and just walking out because of either people you've had a distasteful experience with or ideas you don't agree with. It's sort of a mark of immaturity in that sense. But the real maturation takes place in living on the narrow ridge, what Martin Buber would talk, the narrow ridge of loyalty, very much loyalty and criticism, and always as it's done in a gracious and kindly, it should always be done, and not that way. And so, not as I'm right, you're absolutely wrong, but listen, let's work through this. Let's work through these problems together. When people turn on one another, it's the dead end to meaningful communication. So let me conclude, or so as they would say, so ends the lesson. The Alaskan journals, and Kathleen's going to do this, the Alaskan journals have some degree been ignored or marginalized in the study of Merton's last year of his life before he ended up in Thailand and died in Thailand. And I would say, and I could be challenged on this, but I think his retreat at Eagle River in Anchorage with the nuns and the priests is Thomas Merton's congealed, wise, pithy, and accessible understanding of the essence of the faith journey. And to miss this retreat is to miss the mature, the pure gold Merton, the burnished diamond Merton in that sense. He's brought everything together in a thoughtful, insightful way of just the essence. The other things can be frippery, they can be rabbit trails, but what's the core? What's the real essence? And it is in this retreat, and this is why I think it's what you're doing here. In fact, you are at a place in Merton's journey when the whole thing has come together. The whole thing has come together, and after that, of course, there's no retreats of this caliber, and he ends up going finally to Asia, where he dies. And so Anchorage, Eagle River, you're really in the epicenter of the mature Merton, and this is why it's essential. In Kathleen's book, We Are All Poets Here, I mean, it brings together in an amazing way this period of Merton's life, threaded together and woven together in an autobiographical way. Outstanding in the spirit of Merton itself and its vulnerability, its honesty, the nature of the journey itself. So Merton and orthodoxy. 3 areas, I'll just lightly, like a stone skimming of the surface over the water here. Zhivago, Boris Pasternak, is his really coming into and trying to understand the Russian tradition in a literary way. But theology is shot through Dr. Zhivago, the liturgy, the seasons, the relationship of nature, the relationship of liturgy and nature, and then how does this take place in the context of a revolution which no one would want to live through? What are the great themes, and what are those things which will pass pass like a revolution in Russia at the time, and what do we live into and live from in that sense. And so the revival, in one sense, that's happening here in terms of Merton's time in Alaska and these conferences is absolutely essential that people, if they can, is swim in those waters. It'll take them to fine places of the soul in that sense. So the Pasternak issue, Dr. Zhivago, Merton's writing on Russian mystics is very important. It gives you a sense of the trunk of that tree, and then, as it were, the fruit on that tree. The few things that Merton explored was the Dr. Zhivago, the Pasternak, and then, of course, his retreats here, and each of those conferences. They're so sensitive in what they probe, and they hold together tensions which are not easy to be held together, but he was tried on the anvil of some very difficult issues of life, and he allowed those difficult issues to transform him, to deify him, as it were, and out of that you have a wisdom in his writings, and he's not talking about theology up in the sky. It's theology grounded in the soil and time and people's journey, and this is what makes him, in a sense, a spiritual genius. And I know he's not a saint, but perhaps informally he is for many people, if not formally. And so, as I said, to conclude, it's great that, in fact, this conference is here, and you're really at the center of so much of Merton in Alaska and those final conferences. The Pasternak issue, Conference 2, which I can just briefly touched on with Vladimir Lossky, very important Orthodox theologian. Interesting that in that Orthodox Catholic tension historically, it was Lossky who suggested that the Orthodox need to learn more about Roman Catholic thinkers, and he did his key work on Meister Eckhart, very important Roman Catholic Dominican, often contrasted with Thomas Aquinas. His son did his PhD on a very important Anglican Caroline divine, Lancelot Andrews. So you see from the Orthodox tradition, you're seeing people bridging the tradition. Merton's bridging the tradition, and you can see 20, 30, 40 years later, men and women are continuing forward in trying to bridge that tradition where people need not live in separate solitudes. And so our visit out to St. John's yesterday was yet another bridging, lovely community. I stayed with them for, I think, about 7 or 8 days 10 years ago, and they were the kindest people in the world, just lovely. And so bridging these things is very, and Merton was at the fountainhead or spring of that 1950s and 60s, in which we're getting the summer of that now, and who knows where that will lead. We never know where history is going to take us, but we just faithfully take a step at a time. And as the Tolkien would say, the road goes ever on. Thank you. How's the watch chain? Do all right? Okay, I'll do what I can, and if I can't figure out an answer, I'll ask other people.
Thank you. Do you know if there is a connection between Merton and Gary Snyder, the beat poet?
By the way, I have a lovely picture with Gary Snyder. His book, Danger on Peaks, came out must have been a decade ago, so a bunch went down to Billingham, just across the border. You know, when you go to hear a poet, you think you're going to get 20 or 30 people turn up. We had 700. People couldn't get in. I mean, the man is obviously a literary icon in terms of his significance. But yeah, so I have a lovely letter at home. Actually, it's from Allen Ginsberg, not Gary Snyder, and I was asking, lovely correspondence with Ginsberg, and he sent me his lovely little book on Blake. Of course, Merton did his MA on Blake, and he was starting a PhD on Gerard Manley Hopkins in that sense. So Ginsberg was mentioned in this letter that Snyder was heading off to do an MA in anthropology, and he ended up reading some stuff by Merton, and it turned him around. And so, there are, I did a little book called Merton and the Beats of the North Cascades, and I have a chapter on Snyder in that one. But there are these counterculture Catholics, William Everson, and there's obviously Dorothy Day, Catholic worker. Jim Forrest comes out of that tradition. The Barragans as well. We'll hear a presentation on that later in the morning. But yes, there is in that sense, Merton saw himself as a beat. He often, the beats were monks. What they shared was, like in the Cascades, lookouts were seen as a threefold level in that sense. There was the literal lookout. Many of the beats, say where I live in Ross Lake, that's where Kerouac spent a summer, and out of that came 4 of Kerouac's novels. He was a lookout up there, and the south end was where Snyder was. There was Philip Whalen was there. Rex Roth was just down another lake. It was quite a center of early beat. So the lookout was, first of all, you're looking out for literal fires. Then you're looking out for fires in your culture. What are those things that are wreaking havoc in your culture, destroying the goodness and the best of it, of what it's meant to be? And what do poets and writers say about that? But you can't separate the external world that we live in from the fires that are burning inside. And many of the great beat poets looked at the internal landscape, or as it were, inward bound, and sort of the topography of the inner life, or the landscape of the inner life and the outer life. So a lookout was both literal. It's, in one sense, it's where Kerouac came down and things really went bad after that. Snyder was much more grounded and rooted, even though, just as Merton could be caricatured, sometimes Snyder often was too, through some of Kerouac's works and others. But yeah, to answer your, sort of like an eagle going around a mountain here, yes, there was this interaction and affinities, if not explicit, certainly the contemplative, the relationship of the contemplative to active, ecological issues, First Nations issues. You can go on and on. They're kindreds in that sense. Snyder's interest in Buddhism, the East, Merton shared that as he, late 50s, 60s, that's going on. There were so many relationship of the contemplative and public responsibility. And this is what Merton had to grow out of as well, from initially thinking the contemplative, the spiritual. It was a retreat from the nasty, evil world out there to realizing, no, if it doesn't take me back to people where I care for them and I'm sensitive to who they are, then this is just another opiate. This is just another drug we're taking here. So a deeper understanding, which offended some in the Gethsemane, and basically said, you write these great works on spirituality, just stay there. Just stay in your box, No, he's too big for that. He's a Denali in that sense. And anybody who's a Denali will constantly break through. There's the volcanic side underneath. Oh, he's trying to live. And it's just what his thrust up through the tectonic plates at different phases of life. So that's a long answer to a good question. Thank you.
In his exploration of Russian Orthodoxy, I know that Jesus' prayer is very central in Russian Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy in general. Was he incorporating things like the Jesus prayer or other forms of Orthodox spirituality within his own prayer life to deepen his own prayer life?
Yeah.
And obviously, he's not going to divine liturgy, so he doesn't have that experience.
No. Yes, in his article, Russian Mystics, first of all, there's actually a large book on Merton and Hesychism, some excellent articles by Timothy Ware, leading Orthodox thinkers, and then there's a variety of scholars reflecting on Merton, hesychistic orthodoxy, and all of these, and then there's Merton's articles on these issues. So, yeah, Way of the Pilgrim, Philokalia, he was constantly, because the danger is to use the Indian analogy, we're like monkeys, our mind is like monkeys leaping all over the place. And so in T.S. Eliot's work, Four Quartets, he talks, so what is that, how do we get to that still place in the moving world? Because much of our life is one of being, what Eliot talks about, distracted by distraction through distractions, you know. And how do we cut through those multiple distractions? And that's part of the getting to the contemplative, the slowing down, the being still. And so definitely the Way of the Pilgrim, Philokalia, this was very important. This is what Merton saw in Orthodoxy. I mean, you had the Jesuit, you had the Examen, you had Ignatius, you had all of these, but he also saw, well, so what does Orthodoxy, what can it offer us as we come to a fuller understanding of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic, which has become divided for a variety of historic reasons. And his article, Russian Mysticism, yeah, Way of the Pilgrim, of course, Salinger was very important in the 60s, sort of a voyeurish type or a dilettantish understanding of it. But yes, for sure. And I think this is part of his reason to the East is because he was a highly creative person, and the more creative and passionate you are, sometimes you're exploding inside. And so you need the counter, almost the pendulum side, to slow down. Okay, what's essential here? What do I stay with? What leaves have to fall from the tree? What are the things what are secondary or tertiary things I just bid adieu to, au revoir, in that sense. And so in that sense, Hesychist, I did my first MA on John Cassian many years ago, and of course, the whole thing comes from one of Cassian's one of his conferences, which is being used a lot today. But yes, I would say, again, I'm circling the mountain of your question, so much to it. But yeah, he constantly trying, particularly the Hermitage where he had more time. Okay, it's one thing to idealize being a hermit, it's another thing to live it, as in anything.
Well, I think way too much, and one of the things I think about sometimes is, and I guess my question will be, did Merton reflect or write about any of this? The whole monkey mind thing, the distractions, the way our mind bounces around, one thought leading to another, and it often, the way the mind works, it seems like it makes it more challenging to get to that still point and to really focus on what's important to self or to larger culture, whatever. But did Merton address that in any way? Did he have any thoughts on why the mind seems to work that way when it would seem like in our evolution as a species? And I don't know from a spiritual perspective, but it would just seem to make more sense that our mind did not do this bouncing around thing all the time.
Yeah, a lovely question. I would say at the part of his, and many people, just not Merton, but many of those who are interested in wisdom traditions, they know themselves well enough that they can be victims of their own drivenness. You know, victims of their rabbit trails in their head, victims of the monkey tree. And in doing so, they get distracted. And so the question is, well, who are you back of this mirage of images? Is there anything there? Is the deer there? And most people, there's nothing there, so I'm just going to get busy again. Just take another pill of the Vita Activa. Just pop another pill here, because I don't know how to deal with the silence or salt where nothing's coming out of the forest. And so I just get busy. And so, yeah, this is where certain types of theology do not address the anthropological side So you want to say, okay, these issues of the nature of Father, Son, and Spirit, nature of Christ coming, nature of the sacraments, the liturgy. So what does this mean for actually becoming a different, and facing stuff like that, or rushing from thing to thing? And so this is probably the underlying question of the wisdom, contemplative traditions, the monastic traditions, and that's a lifelong journey. And of course you can, it's like if you're up in the mountain, I mean, you can look at all sorts of maps and topography maps. If you're doing on a trip, you look at splendid pictures, but you're not on the trip, you know? And it's in the trip that you meet nasty weather, good weather, you have tiffs with friends on the trip, things are, so how do we navigate now? And that's always the real test, is not what a person thinks, which is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the sufficient element is so what does this mean for the pilgrimage and the journey of life? And that's the test of good theology, or theologos in that sense, is so what's this mean? And when it comes to, mind jumping all over, rabbits going in different directions, monkeys on the tree, is that who I am? And that's, I think, where the great meditative traditions are saying there's more. As T.S. Eliot says, I'm almost 70, but so I can feel nice about it. Old men ought to be explorers. Not that I'm old, and so it's exploring those elements, of the journey, and where not to go and where to go, what to hear, what not to hear, what's a dead end, a cul-de-sac, what's the royal road, and how do you stay on it? That's a different set of. And that's what I think the monastic tradition, that's what many people interested in the East these days in conferences, and they're saying something's not right in a hyper-driven Western civilization. And the best of the Roman Catholic, the Orthodox, I would argue I'm Anglican, or Church of England, the best of that tradition is deeply contemplative. Just got an email just before I came here. A fellow I did my first MA with, he was an Oxford Don. And he was very involved with the Anglican Orthodox issues in Oxford with Nicholas Zernoff and Bloom and some key people there. And one of them, women, corresponded quite a bit with Merton. She was a leader in much of the Church of England revival of spirituality as well. So, yeah, good question. But it's, a lot of those things is living into it. It's not talking about it, thinking about it. It's the praxis side of it, yeah, and that's where good spiritual directors, mentors, abbas, ammas, starets, we've lost that element in the tradition. Who are the women and men you trust on the journey that are further down the trail, that have weathered the storms of time, and you see in their soul sort of pure gold. So this is why, and there's a bit of revival of that today too, spiritual directors and ammas, abbas. So I think my time is pretty well up. Is it? I don't want to bore you here. Oh, okay.
Coming from a mind that is squirrel-minded
What?
in any direction, coming from a mind that is squirrel-minded
Yes.
in many directions, as I am, did Merton address the issue of both the value of a mind that has many directions and how to find a stillness to distill? Did he address those issues?
Yeah, another lovely question, which really follows. One thing it's important to reflect on, what are those thoughts we should follow? Yes. Where's the unicorn? What's the unicorn we should follow? Good thoughts. And Greek diakrisis is a word in which discernment is very important. And a lot of the great works in spirituality and contemplative is how do you discern the good from the better, from the best, from the perfect, from the bad? And because we have all of this sort of in the animal kingdom of our inner life, in which you have, a variety of creatures running around, who are the ones that we need? What are the dangerous ones? What are those when you say there'd be dragons there? And what are the ones you heed because there's a history of life. There's a history of transformation. And so, yes, and that's where discernment is very, very important in terms of friendships, directors, the life within the body of Christ, the sacraments, the liturgy. I mean, there are all these different things, and the danger is to take certain forms and not understand their internal meaning. So as long as I do this, as long as liturgy, sacrament, I'm going to be fine. No, it has to go a little deeper than that. But that doesn't mean you ignore it. It's very important. It's like where I live, we have a huge river, the Fraser. So you have the banks and you have the river. If you only have the banks of tradition without the water, then tradition becomes a museum, a place for archaeologists. I mean, interesting historically, but irrelevant. On the other hand, if you have river without banks, the water goes in all directions. And so the banks of tradition give focus to our desires, the waters of our desire, and ordering our desires, ordo amoros in that sense. And so this is where for Merton and others, it's what's the richness of the tradition, the banks, and given the water of various directions, how does it go down down the banks of the faith to shape us, to form us, to transform us through the Spirit. So just a beginning, key in the ignition.
Please join me in thanking Professor Rondo. We're going to ask everybody, and I also want to thank John Harmon from the Archdiocese for the introduction of Professor Dart. We're going to ask that you try to be back here pretty promptly at 10:30. There is a whole host of goodies downstairs in the Mickey Center, so have at it. Introduce a really special man. His journey is a journey that I know we have all been on. And, you know, when Kathleen and I first hatched this idea, we wanted it to be ecumenical. She and I looked at one another and we said, if it can't be ecumenical, we won't do it. Period. End of story. I had the opportunity over the course of the last 3 to 4 months to visit several different congregations, parishes, and then I met this man. He welcomed me with open arms. There was no question about, is this a Catholic deal? There was no question like, is Jesus your Lord and Savior? Those are some questions that I got when I visited other places. None of that really matters to me. What mattered to me was that this man said, how can I help? He made calls to other Protestant ministers. One of the main reasons, and Andy, pardon me for maybe embarrassing, I hope I don't, but one of the main reasons that this thing is as ecumenical as it is boils down to 2 men, Andy and Eric Wolforth. Please join me in welcoming Pastor Andy.
The Lord be with you. I bring you greetings on behalf of the people called United Methodist in the name of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. My name is Andy, and I am one of the pastors over at St. John United Methodist Church, your neighbor, not too far away. And I understand that in the past, our 2 parishes have had good and strong relationships between one another. I was born in New England and baptized in the Catholic tradition in a very nominally Irish Catholic family. Translation, we did not go to church. As the Borg was mentioned earlier, if my family were the Borg, I would be 2 of 4. We had 4 kids in a very loud and busy household. And so I have to confess that when I first came across Merton's writings in seminary, that the concepts of nonviolence and peaceful resistance were completely foreign to me. But perhaps not so much for our next speaker. Gordon Oyer grew up in the Mennonite tradition, one that is noted for its strong rootedness in peacemaking and in nonviolence. He grew up in a small dairy and grain farm in central Illinois and earned his Bachelor of Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His readings in nonviolence introduced him to the writings of Thomas Merton, which in turn led him to appreciate Merton's contemplative reflections and his social critique. His love of history encouraged him to seek insights into faith and culture throughout historical inquiry, and he then completed a master's degree in history at the University of Illinois in 1991. His 30-year career as an administrator with the University of Illinois system also exposed him to tensions and contradictions embedded within modern structures today, which make it difficult to put faith-based social ideals above organizational priorities. Together, these experiences combined to inform his interest in the 1964 Merton-led retreat of peacemakers and their conversation on spiritual roots that helped challenge structures of violence and oppression. And in 2014, he published a book on this topic titled Pursuing the Spiritual Roots of Protest, Merton, Berrigan, Yoder, and Musty at the Gethsemane Abbey Peacemakers Retreat, which he then subsequently won the 2015 Louis Award for its contribution to Thomas Merton's studies. He served on various regional Mennonite historical committees and served on the board of the Central District Conference of the Mennonite Church USA, including a 2-year term as conference president. For 8 years, he was the editor of Illinois Mennonite Heritage Quarterly, and he writes on Mennonite history as well as journal articles on the social thought of Thomas Merton. Will you please join me in welcoming Gordon?
Well, thank you, Andy. It's definitely an honor to be a part of this historic conference here in Anchorage this weekend. And want to thank the organizers of the conference, Wayne and Carrie and Kathleen, for inviting me to share with you this morning. It's an honor to do that. I think for several of the things I'm going to say, you're going to hear some strong resonances with what Paul shared last night and also what Ron shared this morning, and I hope at least that they're positive resonances and some helpful reinforcements, perhaps. Last night, Paul introduced Thomas Merton as poet, monk, prophet. And so what I want to try to focus on this morning a little bit more closely is the prophet aspect, especially as it pertains to social issues and Thomas Merton's writing on social issues, social concerns. By the time that Merton had arrived here in Alaska in 1968, in September, he had been writing about social concerns for about 7 years, and he'd been interacting with social advocates for longer than that. And as you've gotten some hints of, there were many who criticized that aspect of his writing and his thought. And Merton himself also grappled with how to balance his vocation as a monk with his personal convictions and his friendships with social advocates. And this was especially the case, I think, in 1968, as things grew more chaotic and also in the years that were leading up to this last year of his life. On the one hand, he was looking for greater solitude to deepen his life as a hermit beyond what the monastery grounds of his Kentucky abbey would permit. And that's one of the reasons why he actually came to Alaska, to see if it might offer some better options. Kathleen's going to be unpacking, as sort of an anchor of this conference, his more of his details of the time that he spent here. And she'll probably mention that a little bit more about that. But at the same time, during 1968, he also continued to publicly address social concerns. In July, as Paul mentioned, in July of 1968, he published his book called Faith and Violence, which was a collection of essays and articles about topics like nonviolence, race, Vietnam War, and some of the contemporary trends in Christian thought at that point in time. And besides that book, he also published that same year 4 articles, different articles on nonviolence, 1 on race, and 3 on Western culture's impact on indigenous people. And so despite his quest for more solitude in the year of his Alaskan visit, he was not at the same time ready to abandon his social commentary. And I've arranged my talk into 4 different parts that try to help illuminate different facets of his social thought. The first one is going to briefly look at why I think that seeing his monastic role as something that is marginal is really important to understanding his social writing. And then I'm going to share some key ideas that I believe framed or helped how he viewed or interpreted or engaged with social issues. Third, I want to share some of the experiences, especially during the late 50s, that helped to broaden his outlook before he actually started to publish publicly some of his thoughts. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the themes that he wrote about that Paul mentioned last night in a little bit more detail, some of his experiences with that. So as far as the aspect of margins and marginal, which I named my talk, included in the title of my talk. During the 1960s, there were many people who assumed that because a monk's vocation removed him from public activity, that disqualified him from speaking on social events, social issues. But Merton saw the monk as someone, as he put it, who withdraws deliberately to the margin of society with a view to deepening fundamental human relationships. And he also felt that actually gave him some distinct advantages for commenting on society. Merton expressed it this way in one of his essays. He said that the monastic and contemplative life implies a very special perspective, a viewpoint of one who is not directly engaged in the struggles and the controversies of the world. This permits the monk to give more thought to the interests of all, the reconciliation of all people with one another in Christ, to stand back from the parochial and the partisan concerns for a better view of the whole problem of the mystery of humanity. In that same essay, he goes on to explain how the daily outpouring of what he referred to in 1960s as manufactured events and pseudo-news by mass media, even in the 60s. And he felt like that created its own addictive reality where, as he put it, living without the news is like living without cigarettes. And he adds to that, my own experience has been that the renunciation of daily immersion in news media stories is to get out of the big cloud of dust that everybody is kicking up, and to breathe and to see a little more clearly. Merton saw this stance reflected in the very origins of Christian monasticism itself. In 1960, he described how the original monks, the 4th century desert fathers, fled to the desert to avoid merging their faith with the political power of the Roman Empire. He saw their society, quoting, as a shipwreck from which each individual person had to swim for their life. They did not believe in letting themselves be passively guided and ruled by a decadent state. And they believed there was a way of getting along without slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. He also recognized that other vocations could also have a marginal monastic quality. In a letter, open letter to Latin American poets, he described them as, again quoting, not in tutelage to political systems or cultural structures, whether communist or capitalist, but as poets who dare to hope in their own vision of reality and of the future. And he said that in this sense, we poets are all monks, for we remain innocent and invisible to the publicists and the bureaucrats. Then in 1968, after he left Alaska and before he departed for Asia, Merton attended a forum of European radical students in California, where a young French student came up to him and said, "We are monks also." He reflected on that comment, and then a couple of months later, in his very last talk on the day that he died in Bangkok, Thailand, he said that the comment implied that the student seemed to be alluding to, this is quoting, the student seemed to be alluding to the fact that if one is to call himself in some way a monk, he must have reached some kind of critical conclusion about the validity of certain claims that are made by secular society, and that the claims of the world are fraudulent. So in writing on social issues from a position deliberately on the margins, like a monk, Merton hoped to offer us this same kind of monastic insight that most of us in the middle of our own cloud of dust otherwise miss. He sought to help us open our eyes to a more Catholic view of the events around us, Catholic with a small c, universal. And as Pope Francis's comments to Congress in 2015 emphasized, his place on the margins enabled Merton to, as the Pope said, challenge the certitudes of his time. Unfortunately, many of those very same certitudes remain entrenched in our culture 50 years later, after his death. Merton's social insight, I believe, therefore continues to invite us to see our fragmented world not with the eyes of our own social and political center, where we are tempted to fearfully scan the horizons for threats to our own immediate short-term self-interests. Rather, he invites us to look with him from the margins, to see more clearly a picture beyond our dust cloud in the middle, a picture that shows all of humanity connected to each other and to God's creation. When Merton considered issues that society faced, he relied on what I think were at least 4 core perspectives to navigate the social terrain. They're connected and interdependent, held together in a mutually supportive web. The first point that I want to make may seem obvious, yet especially in today's environment of alternative facts and fake news, it still needs to be named, I believe. Merton held to the notion not only that ultimate truth exists, but that humans can access it to shape our vision for society. We may not be able to fully grasp its scope or harness its mystery, but we can encounter it and let it transform our responses to life. And I have 3 quotes that I think help explain how he saw our encounter with truth in a more of a social context. For one, he said that social advocates are not fighting simply for their truth, but for the truth, common to them and the adversary. The right, which is objective and universal. For another one, he also described truth as, quoting, a way and a person to be found and followed. Truth is to be lived. There are no simple formulas that will suffice. And then thirdly, elsewhere, he also asserted that the epiphany of hidden truth and God's redeeming love for humanity is precisely the work of mercy. And the great gift which pours out from God's truth and love, is our mercy to others. So rather than rely on propositional statements or verbal formulas, Merton felt that humans access the truth on which we build social relationships by living it out in spiritual freedom and expressing it through mercy and love. And in doing it, we also are living out God's kingdom here and now, since, as Merton put it, to build the kingdom of God is to build a society that is based entirely on freedom and on love. Merton's second point is based on his belief that we all embody some portion of that truth, that we all carry within ourselves a spark of God's divine being, or divine person is the word that he used. And he expressed this through his version of what's called personalism. And I confess I'm still learning about Catholic personalism and the history of that, so keep that in mind. But as I understand it, the idea of personalism emerged among European Catholic thinkers in response to challenges that followed the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Those events prompted some Catholics to revisit St. Thomas Aquinas's ideas on what he called the human person. And it led them to make a distinction between personhood as an identity that is grounded in God, and as Ron sort of alluded to, also as opposed to modern ideas of the individual, which is something that is autonomous and self-sufficient of anything that is greater. So this idea of personalism isn't really a rigid, narrow philosophy, but it's more of a broad perspective on humanity and who people are. At one point, someone named Thomas Merton, who was a key interpreter of Aquinas and also a personal friend of Thomas Merton, counted at least 12 different versions of personalism that were in circulation at the time. And like others in this tradition, Merton also distinguished between the person on the one hand, or what he referred to sometimes in some of his writings as the true self, connecting the idea of personhood with the true self, which we build through, which is guided again by our grounding in God, and the individual, which he then referred to sometimes as the false self, which we build through our own ego and through the demands of what he called mass society. And Merton asserted that the person needs to be rescued from the individual. And again, as Ron mentioned this morning, socially, Merton contrasted communities, which are made up of these grounded people relating to each other as persons, with collectivities, which are made up more of the ego-driven individuals who shift their priorities with the latest social trend that's offered up to them. Nonviolence provided a third point of reference that I think helps connect the first two in practice. And Merton was drawn to it even before he became a monk. He had defended Gandhi's campaign in India as a prep student in England. And in the United States, he registered as a non-combatant prior to World War II. And over time, the models of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and other people like that deepened his respect for nonviolence as a way of relating to others. He saw it as the best way to, again, express truth through love and mercy, even with our enemies and our oppressors. For Merton, nonviolence testified, as he put it, to the truth that is incarnate in a concrete human condition. And even for African Americans who nonviolently sought greater freedom, he felt that, quoting, "the struggle should be primarily for the truth itself, because this is the source of their power." So in short, to try to paraphrase, he's saying that we cannot embrace the truth within others through violence that seeks to dominate them. We can only point toward truth and encounter it with others, rather than coerce them to accept our own version of it. Merton also didn't claim to be a pacifist. He said, "I'm not a pacifist," because for him, pacifism was more of an ideology that limits free response. Neither did he reject the Catholic just war doctrine. But he did insist, as he said, "Nevertheless, I see war as an avoidable tragedy, and solving international conflict without violence has become the number one problem of our time." Merton's fourth and final key perspective that I want to share also reflects to his commitment to recognizing the truth within each person once again. But it moves beyond nonviolence toward other people to also call for our solidarity or identification with others, especially those who are oppressed. And this openness to identify with the oppressed people in turn helps us to reconnect with our own personhood. Merton did not often use this word solidarity. I think it was more often implied, and it was sometimes couched in more mystical terms or as part of the incarnational work of Christ. But the idea is there. And at one point, he explicitly advocated for, quoting, "the identification of oneself with the foreigner and stranger, this ability to find oneself in another, which alone can preserve world peace." And when he was preparing to discuss protest at the 1964 gathering of peace activists that I wrote about, he concluded that the real spiritual root of protest is identification with the underprivileged and dedication to their universe as an epiphany to us. This idea of identification is not the same thing as a paternalistic benevolence or charity, where we assume that we have the answers that we then give to other people. And although he sometimes would refer to himself as a stranger in relation to others, here he doesn't refer to a stranger or the foreigner or the underprivileged as his own voluntary marginal status. He's referring instead to those who are forced to the margins because of something that is intrinsic to them, like involuntary poverty, race, gender, national origin, those sorts of things. So when we view these four perspectives as a whole, I think, again, I see a web of interconnected, interdependent priorities that are held together in sort of a supportive tension. And they offer a certain symmetry, I think, where nonviolence and solidarity on the horizontal level serve as core social postures that point toward the more transcendent powers of truth that is grounded in love and mercy, and our human personhood that is shared in genuine community. Now, admittedly, this diagram is perhaps to people like, Merton and Ron Dart, who do not like watch chain and puzzle solving kinds of things. This is maybe a little bit more, this is not something that they necessarily would have sketched, or Merton would have necessarily sketched out for himself. This is my own little way of, as somebody who spent too many years watching watch chains, helps me to sort of process and portray it. But hopefully it's somewhat helpful. So turning to the third part of my talk, Merton began to publish commentary on specific issues in 1961, but his public voice did not spring up out of nowhere. It had matured over time through various experiences that gradually expanded his social insights. For example, very early, last night Paul shared some of the earlier seeds that would later blossom into his later social voice, such as his grappling with whether his call to embrace poverty meant going to Friendship House in Harlem or meant going into the Abbey of Gethsemane. That kind of thinking was going on from the very beginning. And Paul also described Merton's epiphany on the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in Louisville during March 1958 as a moment of pivotal insight, which it certainly was. And he poetically described that experience as, to my reading, as a deepened awareness of solidarity with others around him, where he could recognize in each of them, as he put it in one of his descriptions of it, he could see in each of them the glory of God like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. That was a profound moment in Merton's life, to be sure, but I think it also reflects a point that is actually along an emerging continuum. As he wrote just 1 week before this epiphany in his journal, he said, "Solitude can no longer mean for me indifference to or separation from what is happening to the rest of the human race." And so this period, this time frame that I'm going to sort of plot out a little bit, again, using Ron Dart's wonderful language, it was a period of, emerging from the winter enclosure into the springtime of engagement. I thought that was a great way to put this period of his life. His global awareness, his perception of social matters, and his sense of identification with others crescendo across these years, I believe, and I'd like to share several other points that I think help to plot out this trend that was happening in his life during these years. For example, one suspects that his mid-1956 reading of the book, of Emmanuel Mounier's book on personalism, offered one catalyst to better focus his gaze outward. And, the thing that Ron spent a lot of time talking about is the correspondence with Soviet literary figures Boris Pasternak and Czesław Miłosz, which Paul mentioned, I think helped him to see more clearly how Soviet and fascist movements denied this human personhood that he was embracing. He demonstrated his expanding personalism in the essays that Ron was talking about, 1959, 1966, on Boris Pasternak, and also on other essays at the time on the topic of love, one that he wrote on Christianity and mass movements, and in the preface to his 1960 book, Disputed Questions, which those essays were collected in and published in 1960. The following year after that, he inserted personalist ideas into many of the revisions that he made to transform a book from 1949 called Seeds of Contemplation into what's really a new book titled New Seeds of Contemplation, which many have said that's really a brand new book in many ways. The arrival of Latin American novices to Gethsemane Abbey in the 1950s also greatly expanded Merton's world. They introduced him to Latin American poets, and his reading of their poetry and corresponding with them, those poets, helped him to weave his own poetic and literary sensibilities into his social awareness. These contacts also exposed Merton to Latin America's synthesis of Old World Spanish Catholicism with its Latin America's native cultures. And that was a worldview, a synthesis that which Merton saw alternatives to the views of the U.S. and Soviet power blocs at the time. In 1958, he wrote a preface to what was an Argentinian volume of what was then his complete works. And he described this new Latin awareness as a vocation, quoting, "to see and to understand and to have in myself the life and roots and the destiny and the orientation of the whole hemisphere." From about mid-1957 to mid-1958, Merton joined in the Abbey's discussions about founding a monastery in Latin America. I missed a slide, sorry. Missed two slides, there, third one. This exposure further deepened his solidarity with the region. As he wrote in the midst of this period in the closing days of 1957, quoting, "In a world with a complicated economic structure like ours, it's no longer a question of my brother being a citizen in the same country. In any time, social responsibility is the keystone of the Christian life. In no time more than ours has this been so urgent and so poorly understood." It still seems to ring true. During this year, he also commented more specifically, as he put it, on the great problem of every South American project, like they were trying to start, entering a country where the hierarchy supported injustice and tyranny, and then in that environment, being on the side of progress and social justice. For instance, something for the Indians of Ecuador. Another point, he calculated how much land a new monastery in Latin America should use up based on Mexico's land reforms of the 1920s and 30s, and the possibility of injecting North American values into Latin American culture haunted Merton, when at one point his abbot shared that he wanted to send U.S. monks down into Latin America and then direct them up from Gethsemane in Kentucky. Merton feared, as he wrote in his journal, a horror of the monotony of good but empty-headed, generous but rather dizzy American monks who are not horrified by commercialism, men without originality, and not too inclined to be Latins or to understand Indians. Merton would revisit indigenous cultures during his last 2 years of life, perhaps more from an anthropological perspective. But during the late 50s, he also showed an almost mystical regard for the marginalized native peoples of Latin America. In 1958, he commissioned an Ecuadorian sculptor to carve a statue of Mary and Child, one that would reveal what Merton called the truth about God being born incarnate in the Indians of the Andes, Christ poor and despised among the disinherited of the earth. When the statue was completed, he felt that the statue of Mary as a native Andean revealed the great mystery of poverty, and the child in the statue, the resurrection to be born from the despised peoples of Mexico and the Andes. At the same time, after he received this, he wrote to friends of his in France and told them that the statue inspired complete solidarity with their protest against French brutality toward Muslims in the Algerian War in Africa, and how he admired their reliance on salvation coming from the most afflicted and despised. And then he added, I want badly to go ahead in somewhat the same direction, but over here, meaning in the Americas. Besides his desire to identify with both North and South American hemispheres, Merton also wrote in his journal of hoping, as he put it at one point, and again, which Ron pointed out so well, to unite in myself the thought of the East and West, of the Greek and the Latin fathers, which to help reconcile, again, Roman and Orthodox traditions. And then another time he wrote, and also to unite myself in all that is good in both Russia and America. This is an interesting statement in the 1950s. All these comments, I think, express this kind of solidarity that I've been talking about that seeks to reconcile human divisions. The ecumenical nature of Merton's emerging personalism also shows, as has been observed, as his expanding correspondence to those of other faiths during this decade's closing years and his reading of the Hindu Gandhi. And by the end of this period in the summer of 1960, yet another journal entry, I think, shows how strongly this personalist views that he held had come to inform his social vision by then. In the summer of 1960, he wrote, jotted down, to discover all the social implications of the gospel, not by studying them, again, by living them, and to unite myself explicitly with those who foresee and work for a social order, a transformation of the world, according to these principles. First, primacy of the person, hence justice, liberty against slavery, peace, control of technology. And then second, primacy of wisdom and love, hence against materialism, hedonism, pragmatism, etc. By the next summer after that, Merton strove to move beyond these journal entries and the letters that he was writing to begin publishing on specific issues. A key letter in August of 1961, he wrote to Dorothy Day, who was the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, that he felt, as he wrote to her, obligated to take very seriously what is going on and to say whatever my conscience seems to dictate, provided of course. It is not contrary to the faith and the teaching authority of the church. He then goes on to lament the silence of Catholics on what he called a critical issue like nuclear war, one on which the very continued existence of the human race depends. And then he adds, I don't feel that I can, in conscience, at a time like this, go on writing just about things like meditation or monastic studies. I think I have to write about the big issues, the life and death issues. And then 2 months after that, October of 61, he put this in his journal. I'm convinced again that in my writing, contacts, letters, that kind of effort, everything should yield first place to the struggle against nuclear war. So for the rest of my time, I want to comment a little bit more about the various themes that Merton proceeded to engage from 1961 onward. Paul introduced these same themes last night using various archival materials in a very engaging way. The approach I'm taking is maybe a little bit less engaging, but I'm going to be focusing more on Merton's published writings, the things that he wrote and published. And to help with that, I'm going to be projecting some lists of some of those writings that I've compiled. I don't expect you to really read the details and process all the words that are up there. I'm going to be throwing a lot of words up there. But I hope that collectively the lists at least give you a general sense of the scope and the volume and the nature of some of the things that he was writing about in these last 7 years of his life. As he hinted at in the journal and Dorothy Day letter that I just read, nuclear weapons and warfare became really the first major social issue per se on which he openly published. And as you can see, the first, well, maybe you can't see, but trust me, the first two items on the list that he published were poems. Oops, I didn't want to do that yet. The story of how he fared with these early efforts to write on this topic, I think is fascinating. I want to share some parts of that with you. His first essay that he published was actually written as a chapter to the book New Seeds of Contemplation that I mentioned earlier. It was titled The Root of War is Fear. This chapter had been reviewed and approved for publication by the censors of the Trappist order, which were the ones who decided what was and was not appropriate for a Trappist monk to publish about. And Merton felt that because the censors had already approved this for his book, that it was okay to go ahead and send it to the Catholic Worker to publish it. And so he sent it to Dorothy Day. However, before he did that, he added 3 extra paragraphs that explained how those chapters' theoretical contents applied in practice to the current nuclear arms race. And so, implying it to those current affairs, he had crossed the line for the Trappist censors. Contemplative monks were to contemplate transcendent spiritual matters, not current politics. And so, 6 months after that, just as he had finished a book manuscript called Peace in the Post-Christian Era, the word finally trickled down to Merton that he could no longer publish on topics of war and peace. But the censors did let him still go ahead and publish an anthology he was already working on at the time and editing called Breakthrough to Peace, provided his name did not appear in it as the editor of the volume. So although Merton obeyed the letter of his order's decision, he sought every means that he could to continue broadly sharing his concerns. In one tactic that he took during this time, he published articles in the Catholic Worker under 3 different pseudonyms. One was Benedict Moore. Another one was, not too cryptically, Benedict Monk. And the third one, which is my personal favorite, Marco J. Frisbee, which is my personal favorite. Merton had a great sense of humor if you haven't already picked up on that. But his preferred method relied on the mimeograph machine. Hopefully some of you are old enough to know what that is. His abbot agreed that distributing mimeographed copies was not publication in the sense that the order had prohibited. So he began mailing mimeographed copies of his writings far and wide. The material that he sent out included the full manuscript of the book Peace in the Post-Christian Era, and also a collection of over 100 letters that he had written to various people during that time period about nuclear war, which came to be known as his Cold War letters. Between October of 1961 and October of 1962, his output, letters, articles, essays, whatever, was massive, such that one biographer referred to this time span as the year of the Cold War letters. As times and the Trappist censors moved on, the order's restrictions on Merton started to ease up. Eventually, Catholic leadership also began to take up that issue as well. Pope John the 23rd published his encyclical Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, in April of 1963. And the Second Vatican Council condemned total wars of mass destruction and supported Catholic conscientious objection to war in its December 1965 statement on the Church in the Modern World. In his November 1964 book, Seeds of Destruction, Merton managed to include many of the ideas that he had originally expressed in that censored book, along with 23 of his Cold War letters. Outside, beyond the church, the August 1963 Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, which was signed by the U.S. and the Soviets, was hailed by many peace activists as a major breakthrough, and it prompted many of those activists to shift their focus away from peace and nuclear war per se, more towards the hot topic of that time, which was civil rights and racial oppression. And in some ways, Merton sort of picked up on this, followed suit, and as with the issue of nuclear war, one of his first or earlier writings to address race was a poem, "And the Children of Birmingham." It drew on the brutal violence against blacks that the nation had been seeing broadcast from the city of Birmingham nationwide in the spring of 1963, and also the 16th Street church bombing that occurred that year. It killed 5 girls. A year later, at the request of a black tenor singer in Louisville, Merton also wrote 8 poems about black liberation that he collectively titled Freedom Songs, with the intent that they would be put to music and then the singer could perform. Those specific plans fell through at that time, but the 4 of those poems were eventually put to music and sung in 1968 at a memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. after he'd been assassinated. Interestingly, to me, as African American resistance turned more militant in the later 60s, Merton refused, as a white man, to condemn that, despite his own nonviolent convictions. He saw that particular shift as the logical conclusion to white America's failure to adequately respond to an earlier nonviolent plea for full inclusion. The 1965 U.S. escalation in Vietnam also prompted Merton to respond in a couple of ways that you might, a couple of ways. For one thing, maybe a little surprisingly, I think, the parallel escalation of the peace movement tactics that were used to oppose the war bothered him. He feared that some of those tactics might alienate many people who might otherwise be sympathetic to calls for peace. And to Merton's own frustration, both of these escalations, the war and the opposition to war, came just as he had transitioned, 1965, into become a full-time hermit. So the clash between more frantic war-related activity outside the Abbey and his increased isolation inside the Abbey came to something of a full head in the fall of 1965. What happened was, within a 4-week period between October 15 and November 9, a flurry of activity happened. started with a Quaker named Norman Morrison, who burned himself to death in front of the Pentagon in protest. And then following that, there were several members of the New York Catholic Worker and the Catholic Peace Fellowship, for whom Merton had signed up as a formal sponsor at the time, who publicly burned their draft cards in New York. And then finally, November 9, a volunteer at the New York Catholic Worker named Roger Laporte also burned himself to death, this time in front of the United Nations building. When Merton learned of this last incident, his concern turned to horror, and he hastily resigned as a CPF sponsor, although through conversations with his activist friends in New York, they helped him to better understand what was going on with those incidents, and he ended up remaining one of the CPF sponsors. But the episode drove home to him the limitations of his situation as he had moved into greater isolation in the Hermitage. And to one of his friends, he confided that, "I'm too out of contact. I never hear anything until it's all over. I almost never have a chance for reasonable discussion or debate. And when I have made up my mind about something, I discover that the whole situation has radically changed, and it calls for a new decision." And so because of that rapid pace, he sort of made a commitment that he was going to only speak out when he felt personally compelled to, not necessarily in just response to what's going on out there. And otherwise, he would just address what he called questions of more or less abstract principle. And these are some of his writings in that regard. And he followed this period of turmoil with a handful of pieces that articulated his own vision for nonviolent protest, and in some cases tended to distance himself a bit from some of the more extreme and what some felt at the time were borderline nonviolent actions of peace movement activists, like draft card burnings, public draft card burnings. And he actually felt that a better path for Catholics during that period, for Catholic resistance to the draft, was the conscientious objector status that the Vatican Council had endorsed and that had become available through the draft law. These writings about his own nonviolent principles, his own nonviolent principles, actually supplemented, I think, in my way of seeing it, supplemented another set of articles that he had already been writing that focused more on others who advocated or expressed or modeled nonviolence in various ways, including Gandhi. But despite this commitment or desire to focus more on principles, Merton was nevertheless totally appalled by the Vietnam War, and he made this known as well. Even in writings that questioned things like, and he didn't condemn them, he just raised questions about them, but he questioned things like draft card burning, draft board raids, and some of the more increasingly aggressive actions of peace movements. He also spoke out very clearly against the U.S. role in Vietnam. It was his solidarity, I think, with the lives of those affected that was in many ways at the core of his opposition, as was his horror at the brutality that the war inflicted on innocent victims. During his last 2 years, Merton also, as I mentioned earlier, revisited his earlier interest in indigenous cultures. And although these writings on one level can be seen in terms of his concern about racial oppression, I think they also touch on how those cultures contrast with our own modern Western culture, including our relationship to the natural world. I think in some ways they reflect Merton's emerging, growing sense that this relationship that we have with the natural world fostered an ecological crisis. When he read Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, he saw parallels about how it described the damage that pesticides did and the threats posed by our own nuclear arms buildup. And the quote that Paul gave last night, I think, really highlights that. And in fact, in that letter that he wrote to Rachel Carson that Paul quoted from, he put a note on it calling it an appendix to the Cold War letters. So he made the connection between what we're doing to the environment, an existential threat to humanity, and the existential threat to humanity of nuclear arms, nuclear war. He publicly expressed this concern most clearly in 1968 in an essay called The Wild Places, which was a review of a book by a man named Roderick Nash called Wilderness and the American Mind. And in this review of this book, he concluded that, as he put it, given the ecological shambles created by business and war, Americans needed to embrace, his words, I think he maybe borrowed this, but ecological conscience, which was centered into an awareness of humanity's true place as a dependent member of a biotic community. And then finally, it's also been mentioned to, there are a couple of other topics that I think belong with Merton's social writings, technology and the disintegration of language and communication. He wrote, Paul may know of others, but he wrote only one that I know of explicitly about modern technology, although he commented on our technological society in many of his writings. And he briefly critiqued it at different points in his 1966 book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. He saw technology as an autonomous force of its own that we humans now serve rather than it serving us. He felt that we embrace technological changes as something that is intrinsically good in itself without considering how those specific changes are going to impact human beings. Another way, he felt that our uncritical embrace of these technological changes has helped to transform the neutral idea of efficiency into a virtue that we revere more than the actual quality of life itself. As for the disintegration of communication, Merton bemoaned how our use of language has grown more superficial, which reduces its ability to promote shared understanding. I can't imagine what he would think of today. As I noted earlier, he anticipated, again, how mass media, especially when it's wedded to those rapid technological changes, can degrade rather than enhance our communication. Merton's influence, again, as Paul so clearly showed last night, was not limited to these published writings that I'm focusing mostly on tonight, or this morning. It also spread through his personal friendships and direct interactions with other people. And he mostly accomplished this through his massive correspondence, although he enjoyed a regular flow of visitors to the Abbey as well. Perhaps some of his most significant face-to-face interactions came during a 3-day retreat, the one that I wrote about, for 13 activists in November of 1964. 5 of these men were Protestants, which gave it a strong interfaith flavor that was very rare in U.S. at that time. And it again reflects Merton's love of ecumenical conversation and dialogue. Under the theme of the spiritual roots of protest, they processed not so much strategy and tactics of activism, but they examined underlying motives for resisting public policies and social norms. They explored how our assumptions about how society works, including, and they spent a lot of time talking about the role of modern technology in that. So finally, to conclude this overview, that was too early. I suspect that based on what I've highlighted this morning, it might be easy to pigeonhole Merton a bit and maybe either embrace or dismiss his social outlook as that of a typical progressive or liberal or maybe even a radical of the 1960s, but that would be, I think, a big mistake. Merton's views were not grounded in the cloud of dust of partisan political ideologies. He actually saw very little difference in the political parties of his day, and he discouraged putting our hope mainly in political solutions. He challenged both peace activists and nuclear warriors alike to reconsider some of their assumptions He believed that the Soviet and the Western blocs at the time shared many of the same illusions, which made them in many ways more similar than dissimilar. Earlier on in my talk, I spent some time describing Merton's web of priorities because it's they, rather than politics, that ultimately shaped his his social perspective. And they spill over, I think, into all of his writings, making it really hard to simply parse out his writing into nice categories like social, spiritual, literary, whatever. Merton refused to separate a spiritual request for our own personal true self from how we relate to other beings, human and otherwise. He saw a broader, interdependent picture of life on this planet that was still emerging through God's creative presence. His focus, it is his focus of tapping into these larger questions, not an obsession with pragmatic policies or policy mechanics, that renders his social insight still so prophetic today. He recognized that regardless of the era, when we focus on the noise of our own individual egos and the clatter of mass society, we permit fear and violence to drive our response toward those who come from different places, those who look different, those who think differently, those who challenge our way of life. For Merton, the antidote to being driven by fear and violence came from our willingness to quiet those voices through silent contemplation, or as Ron put, maybe begin to hear the plucking of the harp. Only then could the presence of our common ground of being begin to seep into our awareness, begin to guide us beyond those certitudes that those voices so confidently assert to us. We do not share, all of us, some of us, Brother Paul does, but all of us don't share Merton's vocation to join an order of monks or nuns. Most of us will continue to navigate the daily challenges of our complex society outside the walls of or outside of a monastic enclosure or the walls of a hermitage. But Merton invites us not to let those circumstances and their clamoring noises have the final say. He invites us, along with the poets and the students that he named as fellow monks, to likewise edge closer to the margins and to open ourselves to a transformed view of the social issues that we all face together today. Thanks.
Wow. Right on time. Thank you, Gordy. Just a couple of quick announcements for the speakers and the folks that introduced the speakers. I wonder if I could ask you to collect with me in a small room right outside of where registration was. We've got a couple of details to take care of. And with that, I'm going to, also, when you go downstairs, you know, believe it or not, we're about 300 and some odd people here. I'm not sure who gets fed first. However, when you go downstairs, if you will turn to the left, and not my other right, to the left, the Knights of Columbus of this parish have set up an incredible feast for you. And they literally, it's crowd control, as it were. So the main serving will be on the left-hand side. You'll go through that room, out into the Mickey Center. And I know that some of you are looking for the D word, the desserts and other things in the other room. Anyway, I know there are some questions for Gordy, and with that, I'll turn it over to Anna. Thank you.
I just wondered, because you had a listing of so many writings up there, and quickly taking notes is difficult, and some of us can't quite see as well. If we go to your website, do you have a listing of those writings that you talked about today, or?
Not today. Not today. That's not a bad idea. Maybe yeah.
Just a suggestion, you
Okay.
know, that because
Yeah.
a lot of those.
Yeah, and if it doesn't get up there, just, you know, if you take down my email, I'll be glad to send it to you too.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, it just went away. Sorry.
So the basis of my question may be a misunderstanding on my point. So if it is, please correct me. But
Sure.
so what we heard yesterday, it sounds like Merton recognized the evil in the Nazi Party before his monastic life, before many Americans did too. And I'm understanding that, recognizing that evil, and then his understanding that war was an unavoidable horror. I'm wondering if he offered any insights or reflections on that whole environment, you know, prior to his monastic life, of how to deal with evil happening from the, let's take the Nazis as an example, how to deal with the Nazi Party without resorting to war.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic question that is always put to people who advocate peace, and it's a dilemma. It's a good question. And the other thing about Merton was, you know, he was focusing mostly on how do I, as someone who is striving to connect more closely with God, how do I respond to that? He wasn't, and I think in most of his social writings that was his objective. You know, other you know, people who are welcome to chime in on this question too, because it's a, yeah. But I don't believe, he did not write social policy, and he did not try to draft political policy organizational solutions. Again, I see it more as how do we, as followers of Jesus, of God, how do we become more connected, and how do we respond in a way, and how do we encourage others to respond? So, you know, I think you know, he registered for the draft, but he did so as a non-combatant. So during, you know, before World War II, that would have been after he wrote the cartoon, you know, about the Nazis. So, you know, he did not register as a full conscientious objector at that time, but. And, you know, I think, he did recognize that there were, I think that there were times when, you know, it was inevitable that those kind of responses were going to happen. So, and in the spirit of personhood, I don't know that he would really condemn people who chose to do that, respond in that way. But I do think that he felt that the bigger and the better way was to recognize that even the Nazis were persons. And that even, you know, there was some small kernel of God in Nazis, and so to hate Nazis was not, as people, as beings, was probably not the answer either. I don't know if that really answers the question, but yeah, as a Mennonite, that question comes at you a lot. And so, yeah, so, and it is a dilemma, and so I guess I'll just try to leave it at that. I don't.
On your timeline, you mentioned he had correspondence with someone named AZIZ. And who is that, and what was that correspondence about?
Yeah, that was sort of supposed to be part of the interfaith stuff. He was a Sufi, I believe, right? Muslim, Sufi Muslim, and I think, you know, I'm sure, I hope Paul corrects me if I'm wrong. I think what happened was that someone else had introduced Aziz to Merton, and then Aziz had written Merton to initiate the correspondence, and then they began correspondence. But it was an example of how he reached out to many faiths, yeah. And that started in late 50s, you know.
I'm just curious if you could speak to his relationship with his abbots, because I believe as a monk he had a vow of obedience to his superiors, and so it seems like there's a thank you to them for allowing Merton to speak and write as he did. Thank you.
So you're wondering about the
His relationship with his abbots.
Yeah, well, there's a guy here who would know a whole lot more about that than me. That's a great question for Brother Paul. I mean, it's just real quick, my perception is that it could be stormy, but at the same time, I think I remember a quote saying that the abbot felt that Merton was one of the most obedient monks that he had. So, you know, that there was tension there, but there was, you know, they lived in relation in the monastic environment, and you know, when I mentioned about the mimeographing, you know, his abbot blessed him doing that, blessed him, you know, it helped empower him to get the word out in a sense. So it was somebody as free-ranging as Merton. I'm sure it was a tough job as an abbot to try to figure out how to manage in a watch chain way, kind of. So I'm sure Brother Paul will have more to say about that. Okay. Yeah. Honestly, it's always been fuzzy to me about when that explicitly was lifted, and it may have to do with the transition of the censor. I'm not sure. Can you speak to that, Paul? It started. I mean, I think the letter was written in early of '62, but the abbot didn't give it to him until like March of that year or something like that. So the abbot that's another thing about the abbot. The abbot sort of held that back for a little bit, and then when he finally finished this massive manuscript, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, you know, I can't publish that. But when that was lifted, I guess Paul's not going to.
Which Paul?
Pearson. Sorry. Okay. There's Paul and there's Brother Paul. So.
Yeah, I don't think there was a specific date when it was actually lifted, but I think there was just such a change in the church, both in the removal, really, of the censorship with Vatican II, but then also with, as you mentioned, Pope John XXIII's Parchment Terrace, and then with Gaudium et Spes. And I know there's one letter where he writes that, you know, if Pope John had to get Parchment Terrace past the Trappist censors, it would never have been published.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon.